are. So Dr. Taylor is an epidemiologist and a cardiologist, and his position is at the Morehouse School of Medicine, where he's the endowed chair and he's the director of the Cardiovascular Institute for Research. And we are just so pleased that he has offered to spend his time with us today to talk about health in the context of adversity, cardiovascular resilience among African Americans. And I can think of no one better qualified to present this talk today than Dr. Taylor, who brings to us his background from Princeton University, Harvard School of Medicine, as well as Harvard School of Public Health. He has a substantial research career, and he was one of the early voices in the wilderness of disparities, pointing out the underutilization of procedures in African Americans, and also the misattribution of symptoms, cardiac symptoms, to non-cardiac etiologies among minority patients. Since that time, he has been the inaugural director of the Jackson Heart Study, something many of us have read about and held in high regard for years. The Jackson Heart Study was a study of people in Jackson, Mississippi, primarily the African American community, and studying cardiovascular disease risk, hypertension, and just generating an incredible amount of information and knowledge about risk and treatment in that population. So we're thrilled today that Dr. Taylor is going to talk with us about this topic, and also the exploration of the MECA Center. The MECA is Morehouse Emory Center for, I'm always getting this wrong, Addressing Health Equity. Okay, so I see you've got your slides up. Are you ready to go?
I think I'm ready to go.
Okay, please welcome Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Dr. Dunbar. I appreciate it very much. And first, let me say, again, thank you for that very warm introduction. And I have to also acknowledge Dr. Dunbar's critical role in the MECA project and in the mentoring and guidance of an outstanding set of postdoctoral fellows who have contributed much of what I'll talk about today in terms of the research, the scientific output. Without that is the real dynamo behind our scientific productivity, these fellows. Further, I would acknowledge at the outset, Dr. Dunbar mentioned my involvement with early on in my career with studying issues of disparities and misattribution of symptoms and healthcare seeking behavior. Prominent in that effort were nursing doctoral students and nursing faculty. And even in the Jackson Heart Study, without the likes of Karen Winters and the late Sharon Wyatt and others, would not have really been accomplished were it not for the tremendous contribution of nursing scholars who helped us not only decide what things were important to measure physiologically, but also in the psychosocial realm. So I consider it a great honor to be speaking with you today, and I hope our hour will be well spent. One thing that I would open up by saying, in addition to this preamble, we have, I think, rightly so, spent a tremendous amount of time and effort identifying and underscoring the excess risk that African Americans face to their health as an ongoing issue. It's been ongoing since the founding of the Republic and to this very day. And we see dramatic evidence of it even in the midst of the current pandemic. One point I will try to also bring forward today is that there is another side of that story, and it's the story of resilience. And I want to emphasize that as something that will be food for your thought and perhaps your scholarly attention in the years ahead. So beginning, my disclosures are listed there. I've mentioned the epidemic, and we'll mention this in passing, but I think as all of us know, the COVID epidemic has really thrown into relief this problem of disparities for all to see. Many of you on this call were already quite aware of health disparities as a fact of American life and American health, if you will. But I think the general public has a new level of appreciation that of that old saying that when America catches a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. The point being that the issues related to health in the African American population are exaggerated, disproportionate, and are devastating in their impact. Now, this not only applies in times of infectious epidemic, but it has been a fact, as I said earlier, for as long as there has been in America. And this actually obtained even through what was popularly known and may still be popularly known as the golden age of cardiology. That is a time when the United States really began to tell a public health success story in cardiovascular disease, the leading killer of all Americans. That success story was an over 40% drop in cardiovascular mortality that occurred between 1963 and today. It's a success story by any measure if you look at the population as a whole. And this slide depicts some of the major inflection points along the way, major developments along the way. But you can see the general trend is one of improving statistics in terms of cardiovascular mortality. But that, as you know, did not obtain for the entire population. These pockets of resistance, like the one illustrated here in Jackson, Mississippi, shows that even in the midst of gradual improvement for the nation, a significant lag was experienced by African American men and women. This particular slide depicts the story in Mississippi versus the United States for men, and you can see that a gap emerged in here, going back to the late 70s and early 80s, but it has been widening since that time, mostly widening. There have been periods where it's narrowed, but you can see that there's this persistent gap. And if this gap persisted, or if it were resolved at the rate that you see it happening here, we'd be well into the 22nd century before African American health and cardiovascular disease was on an equal basis with that of non-African Americans in the United States. This problem, as I have said now 3 times, has been something that has been characterized in America for a very long time. In fact, there were some really incredibly dire predictions about the future of the African American population. And one of the most prominent statisticians of the day at the turn of the prior century, Dr. Frederick Hoffman, and he's notable and important because this is the first guy to make an association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. He was way ahead of his time and highly regarded. However, he published this treatise called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, in which he predicted the extinction of African Americans before the end of the 20th century. There was a tendency then, as there is now, to blame somehow race as the problem, but I think thoughtful scholars are increasingly acknowledging that it's not so much race as it is racism, the response societally and otherwise to the African American, and the racism that is not just the interpersonal affronts and offenses, but rather a system that systematically deprives a group of resources, opportunities, and including opportunities for health and education that feed into this seemingly intractable pattern of depressed health status for African Americans. And I'm not going to make a full argument on that today, but I think just even a glancing acquaintance with the African American experience in America for now 4 centuries would, I think, be a compelling story to say that African Americans have been uniquely facing adverse circumstances for a very long time. And these have very real consequences in terms of health. And what does that do? I mean, what's the connection? The connections of many, I believe that I don't have to make a lengthy argument for that with this group, but just to remind us that racism has a long reach. These structural facts listed here wind up also influencing interpersonal interactions that can have health consequences. One of our most recent papers on racial discrimination and hypertension shows a higher incidence of hypertension occurring in individuals who subjectively report experiences of race discrimination over their life. And the more important episodes of discrimination were not necessarily things like name calling, but rather things like job denial, loan denial, those types of important events that reflect a system rather than just the interpersonal attacks or affronts. Now, I think in this context, we're again reminded that what we're seeing in the COVID epidemic, it shouldn't be surprising. And I think W.B. Du Bois articulated it over 100 years ago. He says, one thing we must, of course, expect to find is that there's a much higher death rate at present among Negroes than among whites. They have in the past lived under very different conditions, and they still live under different conditions. That was true in 1899, and it's true in 2021. A landmark report that I hope that all of you are at least familiar with tried to encapsulate these disparities that America was witnessing in health. And it came out of the Reagan administration back in 1985, and the Secretary of Health at that time was a woman by the name of Margaret Heckler, and she is to be, I think, regarded with the highest esteem because she commissioned this report that really began to usher in this era of focus on health disparities. And I will just go to the punchline of the letter that she used to introduce the report. And she talked about Americans living longer, infant mortality declining, but there was a continuing disparity in the burden of death and illness experienced by Blacks and other minorities. And she called this fact an affront to both our ideals and to the ongoing genius of American medicine. There's a direct line between this articulation of concerns and cataloging and enumerating all of the areas of disparity to the study that Dr. Dunbar mentioned that I had the pleasure of leading in Jackson, Mississippi, called the Jackson Heart Study. So Jackson Heart Study stepped onto the stage where there was relatively little longitudinal data on cardiovascular health among African Americans. And it really was the start of a Framingham style study among African Americans. And I think it's making ongoing contributions to our understanding of various aspects of cardiovascular health. I think it is important to note that the Jackson Heart Study and now many other studies that have come along alongside it really did focus on risk, or really does continue to focus on risk. And it helped us understand what we can expect out of individuals with profiles like the one you see in the slide that I'm now showing. And here we have an African-American woman who grew up in northern Alabama or north central Alabama, outside of Birmingham, where I had my first job as a cardiologist. She was exposed in her life to childhood toxins because that's an industrial part of the world where steel manufacture was dominant, at least until about 1980. But she grew up during that era, exposed to coal dust, iron ore dust. She developed a smoking history. She married a man who worked in the steel plant, who brought asbestos fibers home in his clothing. She had an early hysterectomy for fibroids, questionable indications. She was chronically exposed to the badness of the Southern diet, although it's quite tasty. Being a Southerner myself, I know this. She also experienced the psychosocial stress of living through the teeth, really, of the civil rights movement. You guys probably know that in the 60s, there were common acts of domestic terrorism in and around places like Birmingham, where she grew up, with homes being blown up, public unsanctioned executions, lynchings, and other things that were part of the atmosphere. And on top of all of those psychosocial stresses, the other cardiovascular risk factors I mentioned, she developed type 2 diabetes. Now, this is a profile that if you filled out your standard risk calculator and found that there was an extremely high risk for her early experiencing a cardiovascular event and perhaps dying at age 57, that would not surprise you given this profile. However, this woman that I'm describing lived to be 91. Now, that sounds anecdotal and maybe that's an isolated case, but in fact, I think many people who are in the African-American community can easily attest to the fact that there's a wide variety of outcomes. Everything about African-American health is not a sad or distressing story. In fact, there are people who live through these types of risk factors in these environments who live to ripe old ages, who thrive, who do well. Now, it's important for us to keep in mind the excess risk, but we should not do that by ignoring the success stories that occur. And these success stories, I think, may be uniquely informative to us as a research and healthcare community going forward. And I think these stories of people overcoming can be as important to understand as the stories of excess risk and early death. So health in the face of risk, that really is the motivation behind the MECA study. Here's some other examples. The Jackson Heart Study, while 80% of African-American men above age 60 are hypertensive, that's a terribly high statistic. 20% are not. What is behind the fact that 20% of African-American men seem to escape an almost inevitable diagnosis? The Dallas Heart Study led directly to the discovery of the blockbuster agents that reduce cholesterol by understanding the importance of the deletion mutation of PCSK9. And the group in which that was discovered in the United States was a group of African Americans in the Dallas Heart Study. There are other validation cohorts outside the United States that backed up this research and led to the release of drugs like Repatha and others that are now billion-dollar drugs. But that story of resilience in the midst of risk, or unexpected survival and thriving in the midst of risk, led directly to a benefit to not just African Americans, but to anyone suffering from hypercholesterolemia that is difficult to control or who may have some problems taking statins. And similar results can be found in other studies. Perhaps one of the most interesting is the the disparity crossover that occurs in older ages, where African Americans tend, if an African American and a white person live to their mid 80s, African American survival is at least as good and perhaps better than among whites. Resilience, then, health maintenance in the face of risk. And this is what, again, MECA is all about. And James Baldwin put it as he walked through Harlem and commented on life in Harlem. He says, the wonder, this is back in the 50s, the wonder is not that so many are ruined, but that so many survive. Some opening questions then about resilience. So what might contribute to this? What contextual factors might be tied to resilience among African Americans? There are subjective elements perhaps, as well as objective. Are there neighborhoods of unexpectedly good health? Do the residents of these zones differ in risk profiles? And do they possess uniquely resilient profiles? Pardon me, I'm having a little trouble advancing this slide. There. And what individual, so contextual and individual circumstances and characteristics may be important to consider. What might those individual characteristics be? Psychological, biological, genetic, epigenetic? And are there objective markers of individual physiologic resilience? Can it be developed or learned? And I'm going to, for the balance of the time, talk about results mainly from 3 published papers so far, and there are several others on the way. And again, I allude to the great contribution of our postdoctoral fellows who have really worked hard to get this information into the scientific literature. So the Morehouse Emory Cardiovascular Center for Health Equity. So that's a little bit of a tortured title to make the acronym work, but we wanted it to spell MECA because we thought that given the reputation of Atlanta as the Black Mecca, we like that acronym, but also the fact that it's a collaboration between Morehouse and Emory began to spell out the word for us, and we just fit everything else in. But I think it still reflects our focus, and that focus is to learn more about health disparities, but perhaps from a different angle than is usually taken. Atlanta, again, described as a Black Mecca by Ebony magazine as long ago as 1971. But I think people still use that terminology today. And all of these reasons make Atlanta an interesting and important place to focus. I won't go through them one by one. But I think it's important for us to recognize that with approximately 2 million African Americans in Atlanta metropolitan area, it is an important place for us to look. Also, it's characterized by wide ranges in socioeconomic status among the African Americans. So the idea of the heterogeneity of outcome potentially could be well explored in Atlanta as an ideal laboratory, because we all know that socioeconomic status is very important in looking at health outcomes. So that variety, that diversity, we are using to our advantage in terms of exploring this notion of resilience. Okay, so resilience is potentially a multi-level phenomenon. I think I've actually covered this point, but quickly, factors and levels within individuals, communities themselves may be reflective of a resilience and may be environments that promote health, and community level factors may indeed influence individual health and therefore outcome rates. This is a quick outline of a 3-pronged study that is the heart of MECA, that aims to look at these 3 levels of concern. The population or context level, the individual or clinical level, and the basic science level. And also there is a small clinical intervention project embedded in MECA. My remarks today will be primarily based on the results of the population study with a little bit of the clinical study introduced at the end. I want to acknowledge Peter Baltras and Tanae Lewis as the PIs of this part of the MECA project, and the contribution of Dr. Vaccarino as well. And Mario Sims at my old place in Jackson, Mississippi, also very important. So the idea here was that, are there communities that are vastly different in outcomes for African Americans in terms of cardiovascular disease? And so we set out looking for communities that had vastly different outcomes, and we used three variables basically, looking at cardiovascular mortality, emergency department visits for cardiovascular reasons, and hospitalizations, all among the African American population. And here's a list of the aims, principally to identify communities that either promote cardiovascular resilience or are uniquely identified as high risk. Try to look at what characteristics determine whether a community is one or the other, and in a bridge to the clinical side of things, evaluate the relationship of these factors with Life Simple 7 score, which is a popularly used way to look at cardiovascular health. And indeed, in this paper led by Jong-Won Kim, we identified such areas, these areas where there were vastly different outcomes among African Americans in census tracts that often were just next door to each other. A first pass at looking for these communities where outcomes were very different revealed something that I think everybody already knew, and that is that money matters. People who have means, whatever race, tend to be among those who do well, whereas communities that are poorer tended not to do well. So this was important, and an important part of resilience can be said to be what type of access to resources you have. However, this was not news. We wanted to see beyond the socioeconomic status, beyond money, at what personal and environmental characteristics might be at play. So our statisticians went to work and controlled for median income, and were able to identify communities that had very similar median incomes, but yet vastly different outcomes in terms of cardiovascular health. And this is a notable finding. That is that in communities that barely differed in median income, we found 106 communities that had significantly lower cardiovascular event rates than this other extreme, where we see in some cases almost a doubling of mortality, almost 4 times higher emergency room visit rate, and 5 times as many admissions for cardiovascular disease, all among the African American population, all in communities where the median incomes were about the same, and often in communities that were contiguous, as you can see from the map. So indeed, then, there are communities where outcomes among African Americans are not uniformly dire, not uniformly as bad as we might be led to think, or hearing a constant flow of information about health disparities. Again, that is not to gainsay the importance of health disparities as a real problem for America. But again, to say, let's look and see what happens with people, what goes into making a person or helping a person survive or do well, given the adversities attendant to African American status in the United States. So this next paper looked at individual characteristics and saw examples or evidence of lower than expected neighborhood rates for cardiovascular disease. Okay, and now what we're doing in this part of the study is we're looking at survey results, and we're trying to get a sense of these communities that are so different in their outcomes. What do people perceive? What do people report as the nature of those communities? And you can see that people who were in the survey were less than 64 years old and had lived in their communities for over 6 years. So they were stable. They weren't moving in or moving out. It wasn't a situation that was a very fluid or dynamic in terms of residential change. The types of things we assessed using standardized instrumentation included aesthetic quality, walking environment, safety, violence, and social cohesion, and food access. This gives some examples of some of the questions used in assessing neighborhood health. And we looked at individual resilience factors, and these were embedded in the survey questions about discrimination, environmental mastery, and the rest you can see listed. And these weren't just randomly selected, but the literature supported that there may be signals in these particular dimensions of psychosocial, of the psychosocial experience that might indicate or might predispose people to resilience to certain negative outcomes. And here's some sample questions that we can circle back to if there are more questions about. But this gives you a sense of the types of questions that were embedded in the survey. And the outcome of the survey, this is a lot of information, but it's important to note that environmental mastery, the lack of depressive symptoms, optimism, resilient coping, and importantly, purpose in life were all factors that were found to be tied to those individuals who took the survey, who lived in those resilient communities. And this gives sort of a summary of all of the things that were statistically significant about neighborhood health. So aesthetic quality, safety, healthy food access, and the experience or the perception of neighborhood violence. Those were the contextual features. Individually, mastery, environmental mastery, purpose in life, optimism, and resilience, optimism were key findings on the survey that characterized people who lived in those neighborhoods that had the low cardiovascular death rates. At the Census Tract, looking at these same communities, it's important to note that while the respondents to the survey were all younger than 65, that the neighborhoods, looking at Census Tract data that had higher risk, were characterized by having a higher proportion of people over 65 in the neighborhood. Perhaps even more important is the finding that the Gini index was indicative of larger income disparities in those neighborhoods. So the difference or the distance between the haves and the have-nots in the neighborhood, the more profound that distance was, the more dangerous in terms of cardiovascular health those neighborhoods were. The last paper in this series looks at the relative importance of individual psychosocial resilience and neighborhood context, and how those two things work together in terms of determining a clinical outcome or a clinical variable, cardiovascular health as measured by the Life Simple 7 score. You guys are familiar with the Life Simple 7 score, and it includes both physiologic measures as well as behavioral measures, such as physical activity, smoking cessation, and so on. And interestingly, the neighborhoods that had the best health also were characterized by high levels of social cohesion and activity with neighbors. So this characteristic of social integration, if you will, of a neighborhood proved to be a fairly consistent finding in predicting neighborhoods that had healthy environments or healthier cardiovascular health outcomes. Here we have social cohesion separated out, and you can see that, well, as I said before, social cohesion proved to be an important variable that promoted cardiovascular health. And if you break down the Life Simple 7 cardiovascular health score, the dominant components that contributed to this difference were exercise, diet, and BMI. Activities with neighbors likewise showed to be a health promoter in terms of cardiovascular health in our research. And we see that the components that are most important here, again, were exercise, diet, and BMI. Looking at individual characteristics, psychosocial characteristics, we see too that this list, individual psychosocial resilience, environmental mastery, purpose in life, optimism, resilient coping, and low levels of depressive symptoms all favored cardiovascular health. And we put these together in a composite score for subsequent analysis. And this result, this important result obtained, and that is to say that, let's see if we can make this plain here, that the mean Life Simple 7 scores improved, and the scale was 0 to 14, but they improved with the contribution of positive individual psychosocial resilience measures, as well as neighborhood health measures. And the interesting thing is, if you look at low levels of individual resilience, again, determined by that composite score that included optimism, mastery of life, etc., and looked at people who are from neighborhoods that had low levels of resilience or low levels of neighborhood health, if both the individual and the neighborhood registered low on those scales, then that was sort of the worst case scenario. But if individual resilience remained low, but neighborhood resilience was rated high, you see an increment, although the confidence intervals overlap. But things are trending better based on environmental circumstances. If there was high levels of individual resilience in neighborhoods that were rated low in terms of health and evidence of resilience, we actually see a further increment over having low individual resilience characteristics and a very positive neighborhood environment. And this is an important outcome here. And I think it's important to note that the individual characteristics, again, to name a couple, environmental mastery, optimism, low depressive symptoms, are an important buffer against negative environmental circumstances. And this, I think, is the most important thing to observe on this particular graph, because we move from here to here based on individual characteristics. Of course, having both positive environment and positive individual characteristics is obviously very good, and that's obviously what we want for everyone. But we see that the individual resilience, at least using the Life Simple 7 cardiovascular health score as the outcome, individual resilience characteristics are tremendously important. So in summary, if we take those three papers together, we see this list. I won't read it all through, but the key takeaway points thus far that those resilient census tracts had less income inequality and fewer people who were living in poverty, although the median income itself was very comparable to those high-risk tracts that they were compared with. And respondents living in resilient tracts reported the neighborhoods to be more aesthetically pleasing, less violent, and not to be food deserts. The residents of resilient tracts reported better scores in the areas that appear to contribute directly to cardiovascular resilience. You see the list there. And the residents of resilient tracts reported better scores on optimism, purpose in life, environmental mastery, and Life Simple 7 was associated with individual and neighborhood resilience. So that is where we are currently with the population study in MECA. There are other things that are ongoing and will soon be reported in more detail. The clinical project that's led by Dr. Pimu at Morehouse and Dr. Kayomi at Emory looks at some of the physiologic individual risk factors and hopefully resilience factors that can be found by looking at these sets of factors: traditional risk factors, indicators of oxidative stress, inflammation, and regenerative capacity, as well as indicators of subclinical disease using non-invasive vascular testing. And some of you may be familiar with some of these devices and tests that assess arterial stiffness, endothelial function, carotid, IMT, as well as pulsatile arterial tonometry, looking at things like pulse wave velocity and augmentation index to indicate the health of the vascular tree. And briefly, in preliminary results, it's interesting that activities with neighbors and cohesion, social cohesion, as well as purpose in life, keep coming back as factors that nudge us towards cardiovascular health. And for those of you who think that that you need more than self-report surveys or more than instruments that are expertly devised by psychologists to look at outcomes, here's what we see using some really technical and quantitative measures to look at some of these psychosocial variables and how they influence health. And we see using that type of instrumentation, we're still having the emergence of these psychosocial variables as important in cardiovascular health and resilience. And comparing with a validation cohort in Jackson, Mississippi from the Jackson Heart Study, we see that similar measures, not every measure is harmonized between Jackson and MECA, but where they overlap, we again see factors relating to very similar psychosocial dimensions popping up as important. Social cohesion, again, importantly, occurs over and over. The final aspect of the MECA project that I want to at least make you aware of that is exciting and with results slowly emerging is the look at epigenetics. I think all of us appreciate that the epigenetics is an important aspect of phenotype. Whether or not a gene is expressed becomes as important as whether or not the gene is present when it comes to the actual phenotype that we see. And we know that there are modifiers of that expression that can occur based on environmental exposures. And here's just a fairly exhaustive list of the types of things in the environment that can modify the epigenome and determine whether or not genes are actually expressed. Importantly, traumatic experiences, socioeconomic status in general, and perceived stress These factors, along with things like aromatic hydrocarbons and infectious pathogens, all have been shown to be tied to epigenetic modification of genetic expression. What Dr. Searles and others are helping the MECA project do is to look extensively at microRNA, that those small short segments of non-coding RNA that can inhibit the expression of genes in a post-transcription way, tying those types of biomarkers to metabolites. The metabolomic assessment or metabolome-wide scan that is being performed in Dr. Dean Jones' lab, combined with the microRNA analyses that Dr. Searles is leading, together give us a whole new way of looking at risk and resilience that could reveal some important signatures for resilience that may in turn point to new ways of approaching cardiovascular health and health disparities. And this is a list of some of the preliminary findings from the molecular studies tied to MECA. And I won't read them all, but the point is that there are signals emerging that could lead to some important avenues of further investigation and a consideration of how systems, these multi-omic systems, interact in order to produce health outcomes. Some closing thoughts. Cardiovascular health disparities, again, negatively impact of Black health. And these are real and should always be kept at the forefront until they are resolved. And while Blacks as a group have worse cardiovascular health statistics, there's a substantial heterogeneity, and Black health shouldn't be viewed as one thing. That there we commit the fallacy of one story, that it's all bad and all bad news, when in fact there are incredible lessons, I believe, scientific lessons as well as social, on the path to overcoming adversity. So while, again, for instance, so many African-American men have hypertension, I think there's a story among those who don't when they are in advanced ages. Blacks are often resilient in the face of biological and psychosocial adversity. Again, defying predictions of extinction less than 100 years ago. And individual and contextual resilience factors overlap and reinforce each other and can act in concert to promote health. I believe acknowledging and exploring this heterogeneity and resilience among African Americans may offer new insights and expand our approaches to the resolution of health disparities. I think one final cautionary note is that the ideal scenario for us as Americans, and particularly Americans interested in health, is that resilience would not be so necessary for African Americans. This quote sort of underscores that point, that promoting resilience without also working to address societal conditions that often make resilience necessary is only a partial response. The vast majority of everyday challenges that may affect many but not all African American families, such as institutional racism, poverty, and others, are issues of social justice. We are not only health professionals, we are leaders in society. And I think it is important for us in essentially all we do to really work towards the American ideal of equity in health. And I think acknowledging and understanding the resilience of those African Americans who are doing well despite some really daunting stressors in the environment, I think that will teach us not only about those African Americans or the African American, the challenges that they face and overcome, but there are fundamental lessons about human resilience embedded in that. Every living organism needs to be resilient. Resilience is something that we need to live. The more we understand about that, I think the more we can understand about optimizing health for all people. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Taylor, thank you so much. If we had been in a room together, you would probably have had a standing ovation, and I can certainly listen to you talk on this topic all day. So this was really a great overview of MECA, a great overview of the history and some new things for many of us in terms of the trajectory of health disparities and understanding Black health, cardiovascular health. I think that there are probably a number of questions. I see some chat accolades for you, so that's great. Does anyone have a question? And you can either just jump in with your, unmute yourself, or you can type something in the chat. We have a few minutes, if you're okay with that, Dr. Taylor, with taking a few questions.
Certainly, absolutely.
Great.
Hello, I have a question. I'm not able to type in the chat. My name is Ebony, and I work at Emory in the School of Nursing.
Yes.
And I had a question just about, I love the idea and the hope and possibility of unexpected survival of African Americans in the face of risk. But do you have any level of concern that this could sort of reinforce some negative ideas that are used to justify denial of certain levels of service and care to African Americans?
Right, right. That's such an important question. Thank you. I think that the fact that resilience is almost a necessity, right? And large measures of it are a necessity for African American success and African American health. I think it should not then lead to the conclusion that all African Americans should develop high levels of resilience and function at those high levels. In other words, it's kind of like there was a commercial, I think LeBron James was talking about his rise from very difficult circumstances. And he tells a dramatic story. But at the end, the punchline is the aim should be that there be no more hard luck stories, right? That there not be this need to overcome these tremendous obstacles. I think pointing out resilience does a few things. One, it acknowledges, I think, that in fact, African Americans very often are called upon to go the extra mile to get to the same point, right? Of whether it's in health or other circumstances. Two, resilience is can be defined in a lot of ways. Some people see a negative to resilience in that, I think there's a conflation of the idea of resilience and John Henryism. You guys are probably familiar with John Henryism. John Henryism is this, the negative consequences of high output coping. Okay, so you have a Black PhD nurse and a white PhD nurse. They all have their own challenges, but in most circumstances, I'm going to generalize here, the African American nurse has had to go through some extra hoops to get to the same point, whether it originated in the neighborhood, in educational opportunities, or whether there are actual interpersonal sort of discriminatory things that happen to them. That can take a toll and can lead to excess cardiovascular dysfunction, right? Sherman James, who was on the Emory faculty for a few years, I think, a couple of years back, is the author of this whole John Henryism idea. And it's been shown to correlate this high output coping, to correlate to cardiovascular dysfunction like high blood pressure. That's not, I'm not calling that resilience, okay? So resilience, this overcoming in the face of adversity, this longevity, this cardiovascular health, despite adversity, I believe one is vastly understudied, and it may hold some important lessons for us about, again, not just African American resilience, but human resilience writ large. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I do not want the message to ever be that we should diminish our emphasis on health disparities, right? Because that's still a reality. Still, there are 85, 90,000 excess deaths among African Americans every year, enough to overflow the Mercedes-Benz Stadium for people who should not have died, right? So we have to be clear-eyed about that. But we can hold that idea and the notion of Black resilience in tension. We can hold those ideas in our head, acknowledge and even learn from African American resilience, while also understanding that there's a huge excess toll of death and disease on Blacks year to year. I'm hoping I at least got a glancing answer to your question.
I'm really glad
Yes, you did.
question, Ebony, and it's such an important one, and I appreciate your answer.
Yeah, very.
I think another question that's come up is, do you see any other health outcomes in the African American community that could benefit from this same type of focus as MECA? So, thinking about the community and this resilient factors of neighborhoods and individual, I'm thinking about CKD and the tragedy of the increase of chronic kidney disease in Black Americans. And certainly you've alluded to COVID. And so that's a great question.
It's a great question. And I think it's an important consideration. We actually just submitted an R01 looking at the intersection of COVID and cardiovascular resilience. And there are many reasons to think that some of the aspects of cardiovascular resilience would be very important in COVID. Just mechanistically, there's such overlap between cardiovascular outcomes and COVID. You guys are aware of the excess thrombosis, the heart attacks, the strokes that are occurring in the post-COVID or peri-COVID infection patients. But beyond that, some of the same both physiologic and psychosocial factors that prove protective in cardiovascular health may indeed be protective in a variety of systems.
Good. Let's see, Ursula asks, is there a particular aspect or dimension of resilience that you think is primary to consider in the context of Black lives?
In the context of, I'm sorry, my volume's not good.
Of Black Americans.
Yeah, well, I think I would look at the components of our score, and obviously everything we're doing, these instruments are still fairly blunt, right, to analyze all of this. And MECA is exploratory in many ways, but some of the instruments we use assessed optimism, assessed purpose in life, assessed environmental mastery. And I think for individual attributes, this notion of mastery and purpose, I think, are critical. And I think these are things that can actually be intervened. I'm not a psychologist, but can be intervened upon and facilitated as children grow up, go through the educational system, experience a variety of scenarios along life's journey, and can also be injected into the patient experience. Some early experimentation with this looks at diabetic management and diabetic self-management, and the importance of framing the instructions in terms of self-mastery, right, versus sort of the often paternalistic kind of instruction and leading someone through it. And to the extent that mastery and purpose can be effectively injected into the curriculum, that there seems to be an early signal that people actually do better with focusing on those aspects of behavior.
Okay, well,
Dr. Taylor.
this has been a great presentation, a great set of questions. We'll have you back, Dr. Taylor, at another time when you'll have more results. And I think people are going to class, and we just appreciate you being here with us so much. Thank you for this great talk. Thank you.
Listen, thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, thank you, Jessica, for helping us and recording. And we'll make it, figure out where to make it available. So really appreciate it.